Chag Sameach and Shabbat Shalom. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed that interesting look into the pilgrimages that happen around the holidays in Israel. Now, you know that in ancient times, there were three major holidays. There was not Rosh Hashanah, not Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Pesach, and Shavuot. Sukkot is what we are celebrating now. Pesach is very familiar for everyone, the Seder obviously, and not eating chametz. And Shavuot, a little less well observed, the festival of counting of weeks, 7 weeks from Pesach to Shavuot. Not the festival of receiving the Torah, that comes much later. Initially, it was meant to be a summer festival, just like Sukkot is meant to be a harvest festival. And the reason for sitting in a sukkah, sitting in a booth, there are many reasons for it, but primarily the reasons that we are told are because our ancestors dwelled precariously. And they lived in a desert that's precarious, the weather, the heat, the fog, the clouds, etc. And they were protected for whatever that means. Anane HaKavod, the clouds of kavod, of glory, protected them. And people have said, we want Anane HaKavod, clouds of glory, not Anane HaKovid. Fair enough, we don't want clouds of COVID. Absolutely, we want that to disappear. But we live in precarious times, and there is absolutely every reason in the world to act out your precariousness. So if you wanted to apply a modern day thinking to Sukkot, Sukkot would be a time where you go camping. You leave your home, you leave the comforts of home, you leave the bolted lock on the front door and the alarm system, and you leave the brick with insulation, and you take a tent and you go up to some park or some campground, and you live outside, and you're subject to the wind, to the rain, to the animals, to temperature, and so on. That's really what Sukkot was all about. Now, why this form? Because you would have been harvesting your fields. Every person that entered the land of Israel with Joshua received a piece of land. So harvest festival would have been now for everybody. What do you do when you're harvesting? You can't go home every night. Often your fields are too far, and you have to be up first thing in the morning. You work till sundown, and you get up at the crack of dawn, and obviously there's a lot less night than there is day. So instead of having a time to go home, you would eat in the field. Your workers and you would probably have a hut. You'd sleep overnight, vulnerable, and you'd wake up in the next morning, and at the crack of dawn, and you're back to work. And that's what you did because the time is short, and the work is much. So that is how Sukkot comes to be a festival in which we sit in a booth. And that is one of the primary elements of Sukkot. We cannot ignore that in favor of, let's say, the four species, which we don't use today. We don't use it because it's Shabbat, just like shofar. We don't use the instruments of celebration on the celebration itself if it's Shabbat. But tomorrow, we'll have a chance to address the lulav and etrog. So I want to give you some of the underlying background of Sukkot and then talk about a few things specifically. First of all, Sukkot can be understood as the festival of liberation. It was the first festival in which they were exposed to the elements in the desert. Other than Passover, this was the next one that would have come along, and they would have felt quite vulnerable at that time because winter is setting in. And when winter sets in, obviously in a desert, as you know, the desert is extraordinarily hot by day and extremely cold at night, and the temperature drops very quickly because there's no moisture in the ground. The temperature changes very rapidly. For those of you who have never experienced that, that is another way in which you could experience the vulnerability of Sukkot, being in a place that is super hot by day or even moderately hot, and then experiencing almost sub-zero temperatures instantly at night. So there's 40 years of wandering, obviously 40 years of vulnerability during traveling for many reasons. Sukkot also commemorates part of the Exodus. One of the destinations in the many journeys they had during their 40 years of wandering was a place called Sukkota. And the root word of Sukkot is schach, or sach, which means to cover, or to maintain intimacy or closeness. Sukkot is a 7-day holiday, and it's interesting that the 7 days are celebrated in North America and countries outside of Israel as 8. And on the 8th day, we have an additional festival called Simchat Torah, which is a celebration of completing the cycle of reading the Torah. But that, again, is a very late add-on to the festival of Sukkot. Don't conflate the two. Don't believe that Simchat Torah and Sukkot are really the same thing. This is once we are together, let's have a Torah ending party, which unfortunately this year, as you know, that requires people really in person. I'm sure there are people who will do things online. I don't know what we'll be able to do, but we'll try to create some kind of joy of ending the cycle of Torah reading. There's a very interesting tradition about Sukkot. The Sukkah is the singular of Sukkot. Sukkot means many booths, and Sukkah means single booth. And every person's Sukkah, it gives you an opportunity to invite guests. Who do you want in your Sukkah? So there's a traditional seven ushpizin. Ushpizin, an Aramaic word meaning guests. And traditionally, it's Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, David, Solomon, etc. And there are women, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah, etc. But you can invite anyone you want. And I've always suggested that people use the opportunity to put up in the sukkah their pictures of their family and their ancestors, and perhaps people in their family who were killed in the Holocaust, or people who died young, or people who never got a chance to live fully, and people who did get a chance to live fully, and put them up on the wall and invite them, and invite their memories, and invite conversation, and invite people to come and share with you. Obviously, this is not the year. My sister sent me a photo of the 7 guests in their sukkah. Each one had a mask with their name on it, waiting for the guests. Obviously, the imaginary guest would have to wear a mask. And then there's what I showed you earlier from Zechariah in the universal aspect of Sukkot. It invites all people to come on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So in ancient days, not only would you and your family have gotten on a horseback or donkey, most likely, and ridden up to Jerusalem for this festival, for this 3-part festival, Sukkot, Pesach, and Shavuot, where they were all pilgrimage festivals. You would have gone up to Jerusalem. It invited the entire world to come up, whereas Passover Seder is traditionally a Jewish event. Not that non-Jews are not welcome, but it's focused on the Jewish experience. Sukkot is a universal experience. We all experience the same vulnerabilities. We all experience the same fears and anxieties. We all, as human beings, worry. And therefore, the Sukkot pilgrimage is entirely appropriate for everyone. And the temple was opened to the world. And that is why you still have, to this day, nations of the world literally arriving in Israel to celebrate the Sukkot festival together with the community. You probably didn't know that. So the other part of Sukkot, which we'll talk about tomorrow, is the 4 species, but you can see in front of me the arava, the willow branches that we will talk about tomorrow. Now, the thing about Sukkot is it's very deeply ingrained. For those of you who have observed Sukkot by having a sukkah, you probably have had an experience unlike anything other, where food comes out, it has to be consumed fairly quickly in our country because it's pretty cold, the risk of rain, you're always worried about the weather, you're always worried about, do I take the cover off, do I put it back on, what if the cover blows away, the wind. I've been in the sukkah when there was snow, literally freezing. My family is very, very observant, and obviously they would do everything in their power to be in the sukkah. But the rule of sitting in a sukkah is you cannot be unreasonably uncomfortable. So it's similar to things we do. Reasonable uncomfortable is fair. You go to a funeral because you're obligated to support the mourners or you're part of the family. You go, you're not leaving because it's a little cold, but there's a tolerance level. In February, some funerals, you stay in the car until we lower the casket, you come out and there's 3 minutes and you go back in your car and you go. And that's acceptable because it's minus 22 with wind chill. Not safe to be outside. But the sukkah, they want you to be moderately uncomfortable at the most. In other words, raining, drizzle, stay inside until you're uncomfortable. But when you're uncomfortable, you go in. Don't be what they say, and this is a rabbinic expression. I didn't make this up. This goes back thousands of years. Don't be chasid shoteh, which means a foolish pious person. Your piety is appreciated. Your effort on behalf of the mitzvah is appreciated, but don't be foolish. Don't be silly. And therefore, when you sit in a sukkah, if you wear a coat and boots and scarf like we've had to in years past, it's fine, it's comfortable. Hot soup comes out, you sing, you hang in there. But if it's raining, typically people do not go in the sukkah if it's a significant amount of rain. And there are those who consider the interplay between the person observing the mitzvah who is sitting in a sukkah for the mitzvah's sake. In other words, they imagine it's God's commandment and they're sitting there because God told them to. And then on a night, imagine if it's pouring rain, now you have the dichotomy. How do you justify doing a mitzvah for God's sake and God is making it rain? What does that mean? Is that a message? Is God telling me he doesn't want my mitzvah? Well, they see it as the expression of the Talmud is, it's like somebody a servant who brings a cup of wine to his master or to the king to drink, and the king flings it back in his face in rejection. So they perceive the rain on Sukkot as a rejection, specifically on the first night, if they can't fulfill the mitzvah on the first night of dwelling in a sukkah comfortably, they see it as the king having tossed the cup back in the servant's face. Now, that's a degree of intimacy with the divine will that I don't have. I don't see it that way. I see the sukkah itself fundamentally as about being vulnerability, including the vulnerability to performance of mitzvot. And actually, we should embrace the fact that sometimes we can and sometimes we cannot. However, to each their own. Some people see it one way, some people see it another. But I do remember sleeping in the sukkah. I think I slept there a few times in the sukkah. I don't remember what the circumstance was. Maybe it was in Israel. It was much, much warmer. I was there one year in Sukkot. It was super, super, super hot, unexpectedly. I do remember sleeping in a sukkah one night. It was particularly cold. I remember, though, there was something really cool about sleeping in a sukkah. And I had friends whose Sukkot were well appointed. They had carpet on the floor, which made it a lot warmer. The father was in some rug business, so there were Persian rugs hanging from all the walls. It was gorgeous. They had a built-in sink that they brought from inside the house, so you had hot and cold water right in the sukkah. In the tradition of our ancestors, the sukkah was never a place that you brought pots and pans in. You treated it like a dining room, not a place where you'd bring the soup pot and ladle from the soup pot. So you always serve on your fine china in the sukkah when you're eating meals, but you don't treat it like a temporary dwelling in the sense that you would bring in or cook in the sukkah. You would actually cook elsewhere and bring it in. The sukkah would be a dining, living space as opposed to a working space. And I think one year we brought a TV in the sukkah because part of the tradition is Basukot Teshvu Shivat Yamim. You should reside in your sukkah 7 days, not live there temporarily, like dip in, dip out. No, it was meant to be a comfortable, if vulnerable, dwelling. Many people had it attached to their homes, the sukkah. And in a few minutes, I'll talk to you more about the construction of a sukkah. But this sukkah particularly, I remember very fondly because it was warm, it was comfortable, it was intimate, and it used cedar as a covering, not bamboo. The bamboo was there actually to keep the cedar from falling through, and it created a huge amount of warmth and comfort. Even on the coldest day, we were able to sit and hang out in the sukkah, and I have very, very fond memories. If I do get a chance to build a family sukkah at some point, I would appoint it in a way that would make it extremely comfortable and warm, even if somewhat vulnerable because it is outdoors. I think that's the way to go for people who are interested in sukkah. So the construction of a sukkah is a complicated thing, but it's actually built on very simple rules, simple principles. And before Musaf, I'm going to share with you some more information. Mayim Bialek's going to have a little clip talking about her feelings of building a sukkah. You'll see other sukkot being built, and you'll see something really, really interesting, which is a sukkah design competition. Because for a sukkah to be kosher, it has to fulfill certain criteria, but they're pretty narrow. It has to be a minimum height, like basically 2 feet high. It has to be big enough for a person to fit in, moderately comfortable. Now, if you have a sukkah and it's 2 feet wide, you're not getting a whole person in there. But the rabbis say if you can get rosho virubo, your head and most of your body in the sukkah, and that would be for an average person. They wouldn't measure my size versus someone else. An average person, if they could get their head and their torso in there, that would be considered acceptable. So in certain circumstances where someone has a tiny porch and they don't have the ability to build a sukkah, and they built a tiny little sukkah, that would be acceptable. I have a Jeep. You take the doors off the Jeep, you feel like you're completely outdoors, but even if you leave the doors on, you know what you can do? You can take the roof off. If you have a convertible, you can take the roof off. You know what that means? A sukkah, the walls of a sukkah can be built of anything, so long as they stay in place. The rabbis exaggerate and they say you can build it using 4 elephants that don't move, if you can get them not to move. Just to illustrate for you how the walls of a sukkah can be absolutely anything, so long as they keep their shape. What really is important in the sukkah is the covering. It has to be schach. Schach means to cover. And the covering has to be of natural harvested vegetation. It cannot be connected to the ground. So, for example, the willows in front of me are no longer connected to the ground. That would be schach. If you typically, as you would in the fall, be harvesting grain and have all kinds of bulrushes and things that you're harvesting for the winter, for warmth or whatever, it would be perfectly appropriate to take all that stuff and put it on top of your sukkah and create a warm cover made of harvested vegetation. So if you're in your convertible and you took a little bamboo mat and put it over the top of your car while you're sitting inside. So if you're in a convertible, you leave your windows up, and you have probably a bar across, a safety bar, put a mat over it, 3 minutes, you got your sukkah, you make the blessing, le'shev basukkah, and you're thinking, le'shev ba convertible? No, le'shev basukkah. You're actually sitting in a sukkah because legitimately you are in a sukkah, 4 walls and a cover. And in a Jeep, you can do the same thing. You just can't drive under a tree and say, I'm in a sukkah, because the tree is still connected. But if you cut off the branch, put it on top of you, you're good to go. So it's really interesting how they made sukkah so incredibly portable and useful, because you could use any structure with 4 walls and just put some vegetation over it. Many of the homes would have been built with 4 walls, and then a dome would have been applied, but often domes collapsed, or they just built it without a dome and left it open for sukkah. When I was a kid, there were some wealthy kids in my class, and the true sign of wealth in that Orthodox community was that you had an outdoor sukkah that was part of your home. It was built with brick, and it was insulated, and it had everything that would have been in your home. The only difference was it had a removable roof that for Sukkot, they could pull the skylight back, and you had a sukkah built into your home. That was rich. And actually, it's a great idea, although I didn't quite feel that I was in a sukkah when you had that. It didn't have the same feeling that we had at home of flimsy and wind and battered by the elements, which I kind of liked a little bit. So, having said that about sukkah, there are some other rules. You have to have tziltza meruba mechamsa, which means you have to have more shade than sun. You have to be able to see the stars through the schach, which means you can't cover it like a roof. It has to be still a little bit vulnerable. You have to have space. You have to be able to look through and see the stars, which is actually a beautiful thing. The irony of that tradition of seeing the stars is that Sukkot comes at the 15th day of this month of Tishrei. And on the 15th of the month, we know most Jewish holidays come on the 15th of the month because it's the full moon. When you're in a pilgrimage festival, you want to be walking to Jerusalem, or you want to be out and about at night without street lamps. You want to be out on a full moon night. So festivals all begin on the 15th of the month in the full moon, which means the possibility of seeing stars is pretty low unless the moonrise is a bit later and you see the stars through the schach. So the stars are not only for the end of Shabbat, which is not really in use anymore, but it's also a measurement of whether your sukkah is kosher or not. The maximum height of a sukkah, there's a maximum. It can't be more than 20 handbreadths, so probably about 22 feet, or it depends on an arm length is. So whether it's 2 feet apiece, 40 feet high, 35, whatever. But the idea is that when it's that high, no actual light will penetrate because the angle of the sun will never get light straight down unless it's overhead. So therefore, the sukkah would be too dark. So there's a minimum height, a maximum height, and that's why when I illustrate for you later, you'll start to see that a sukkah represents how you feel. A sukkah represents where you live. People work in their minimum and maximum space that they have. But this year, the rabbis have finally started to realize that the pandemic is real. And many of them have said, please don't invite guests to your sukkah this year. Have a personal sukkah for family, and do not have guests that come from the outside. One of the interesting things we've been talking about is what are the guidelines? Is a sukkah considered a closed space or an outdoor space? If it's an outdoor space, well, why not have more people in it? And the general guidelines are treat it like an indoor space. And now with the reduction in bubbles and the caution about new people and about inviting people into closed spaces, every precaution necessary should be taken. Even if your sukkah is flimsy, treat it like an indoor space. Invite only the people that you are safe with. And if anyone does come in, they should absolutely wear a mask. Do not treat it like an outdoor space, simply as a precaution. But in Jerusalem and Israel and other observant communities where Sukkah is a big, big deal, and it's not just for Orthodox Jews, it's for all Jews, where Sukkah is a big, big deal, we have to be careful this year. There have been reports that people are building, that certain communities have built massive, large sukkahs, which they tend to do every year, and it remains to be seen what will happen with those Sukkot. Israel, as you know, is on significant lockdown, and there's been a definite disregard by certain communities, and it's shocking and it's terrible. One day we might look back on this and talk about the civil war amongst Jews, where Jewish people disregarded science for the sake of whatever tradition they had and became killers. It's a terrible, terrible thing, and we hope that Sukkot does not exacerbate that, nor does any of the Jewish holidays, although we have serious concerns about all the kids that were in yeshiva that went back home, 6,000 kids that have contracted COVID in Israel. It's terrible what's happening, and we have to hope that they do not see a huge resurgence 2 weeks from now once Sukkot is over. So that is the story of Sukkot. You'll see more about the building of Sukkah later. Tomorrow, when we focus on the 4 species, we'll have something else. I have a beautiful talk by Rabbi Sachs. It's gorgeous stuff about the essence of the holidays. That will happen. All will happen just before Musaf. Also, just before Musaf, you will hear what would have been sung in Shul, which is the blessing of the Kohanim, the blessing of the priests. Chaim Yisrael sings a beautiful, if not a little long version of it. It's beautiful music. Enjoy it. Give yourself some time with it. And then tomorrow we will share images of what that would look like at the Kotel with all the Kohanim doing the blessing at the Western Wall. It's quite the spectacle, hearkening back to the ancient times when we were able to do it in the Beit HaMikdash, in the Holy Temple that was built. On that note, something really wonderful for Sukkot, 15 Jewish names or baby names that are inspired by Sukkot. Very cute. So for girls, Hadas. Hadas means myrtle, and obviously one of the 4 species. It smells absolutely beautiful. Myrtle grows everywhere, including in Ontario, and I have a great story about that. Maybe I'll tell you tomorrow about the 4 species in Killarney Provincial Park. So Hadas is the myrtle. Livana, my favorite, is moon. It means moon, and a girl's name, Livana. It also means white, Lavan, because the moon is pale. The beautiful full moon is pale. And it's interesting that they called the Levana as a Sukkot name because if you were able to see the Levana through the Sukkah, you knew you had a kosher Sukkah. And there's something quite romantic and beautiful about sitting in a Sukkah with the moonbeam shining in to your Sukkah. Mayim, like Mayim Bialik, is water, and because part of the traditional festival of Sukkot involved water, and the taking of water from the river and returning it back to the river in hopes for a good season of rain. Mayim is also a girl's name. And Me'ira means one who illuminates. It's really one of the great festivals of Sukkot, which you might not be familiar with, is that water drawing festival in which they had huge amounts of fire. It was a fire festival. Hopefully we'll talk about that throughout Sukkot. Then there are other unisex names that can go for either boys or girls, like Dekel, which means palm tree. Obviously the lulav is from a palm tree. Hadar means glory, because the mitzvah of taking a citron or an etrog was Ve'lakachtem lachem bayom rishon pre-eitz hadar, the fruit of a tree, hadar, which means a glorious fruit, not just an ordinary fruit. It had to be something spectacular. Hallel, I don't know that many people called, I know people Hillel, but I've heard one person named Hallel, which means praise or thanks. Obviously, Hallel is recited during the Sukkot festival. Mor is similar to the word myrrh in Hebrew, and myrrh is a resin from certain trees, but mor would have been the smell of Har HaMoriah, the Mount Moriah, which had the same thing as mor. And mor was a beautiful smell, and obviously referencing the smell of the four species. So mor, ubisamim, myrrh and spices would have been a name. Mor would have been a name emanating from the smells of Sukkot. Simcha meaning joy. It's pretty obvious. It's Zman Simchatenu, a time of festival of joy. And Stav is an interesting one. Stav means autumn. And this is obviously the festival of autumn. It's the change of season. And Sukkot is a time in which people think about the change in their lives and the harvest of their lives, so Stav is an appropriate name. For boys specifically, there's Alon. This is more of a Kabbalistic name, because Alon really means an oak tree, but there's a certain sturdiness of spirit, and the fertility aspects of the harvest holiday, they've included the oak about genetic strength and so on. Maybe not so connected. Ilan means tree, and obviously it's a festival of the environment and greenery. Omri is a Hebrew name that means a sheaf of grain, counting the Omer between Pesach and Shavuot, but grain is the crop that is primary crop harvested in the Sukkah time, and this would have been the end of the harvest festival. So Omer or Omri means my sheaf of grain. It's a beautiful name. Raviv means rain, but it means abundant rain, a beautiful rain that is just strong enough to penetrate the ground, but not too strong to flood. It's that beautiful balance, and the prayer of Geshem, of rain, is obviously something that we hope for on Sukkot. Tevel means the universe, and it means dearly loved in Yiddish, but it's a beautiful name to celebrate the universal festival of Sukkot, just like we started talking about the idea that Zechariah references that it's a universal festival for all the nations. So those are 15 names that emanate more or less from Sukkot, but it's a beautiful way to end our talk today with some wonderful thoughts of naming babies for a Jewish holiday. What a beautiful idea. On that note, wish you all Chag Sameach, and we'll be back in a few moments with conclusion of services.